Hi, I'm Stephen Hand from Archery Supplies, and today we're going to try some 400 spine arrows and see if we can get them the spine out of the recurve. So I normally shoot a Fivix Argon X riser with some 44-pound limbs. At my draw length, 29 inches, they weigh 51 pounds on the fingers when it's about to be shot. Now, when I went to 400 spine arrows, they were too stiff for the bow. So the question was, well, I can wind them up. But the problem by winding it up, I don't know how heavy I've got to go before the 400s will actually tune. So I tried heavier points. So I tried 200 grain points with the 400s, and they were still too stiff. So what we've done today is I've grabbed another riser and I've wound it up. So I've wound it up to 53 pounds, and we're going to try 400s with that. So the first arrows we're going to try, these are Skylon Paragons 400s with 120 grain tungsten point. We're standing at about 10 meters from the target. So we're going to just shoot a couple of arrows with vanes and sort of see how they shoot. So the reason I went for a new riser as opposed to just putting limbs, it gave me flexibility so I could wind the bow up or down to get the arrows to tune. If I just grabbed another set of limbs, then I'm not sure what's going to happen, what size points I'm going to need, what I'm going to do. So what I'm trying to do is to get this bow to shoot the 400s. But I had two agendas with this video. One was to get the 400s with 200 grain points to shoot, and also then to get the 400s with 120 grain points to shoot. Now, this is the bare shaft 400 with 120 grain tungsten. Now, if the arrow is too stiff, which theoretically it should be because it's only 2 pounds up in poundage, the bare shaft will be out to the left. If it's too weak, it'll be out to the right. Now, I haven't done any kind of setup. This is me, like I've just set up the bow, fitted the sights, stabilizers, fitted the old limbs to the bow. Now let's go and take a look, see how that went. Okay, so at 10 meters, that looks really good. And that was only going up in pounds, 2 pounds. But going up to a 200 grain point from a 120, 80 grains, I didn't have the effect. And someone on the Recurve forum said, well, how much does point weight affect the spine of the arrow? And someone said 3 pounds, 20 grains, 20 grain point is equivalent to 3 pounds. And I'm like, well, I've gone up 80 grains in points, so that should be about 10 pounds. So I'm like, well, that doesn't make sense to me. So that's why I wanted to do this video and test it and sort of see how it compares. So for me, the 33, and I know before when I went up 2 pounds, the arrows became too weak, the 500 spines, and the 400s were too stiff still. So I was in a bit of a no man's place where I couldn't, I didn't know whether to go up further. I didn't know what to do, so I just wound the bow back and just shoot the arrows I had. So what we're going to do now is we're going to shoot the 200 grain point arrows and see how they shoot. Now with compound shooting, I don't really worry about shooting a compound too much. Compounds will generally shoot fine, but shooting a recurve is very different. Recurves are very sensitive on arrow spine because they have to wrap around the bow. So these arrows are McKinney's, so they're a little bit different to the last arrow. They've just got normal nocks at the back end, so they're reducing the weight at the back. So if you reduce the weight at the back, it's the opposite of putting weight on the front. So adding weight here softens the spine, adding weight at the back stiffens the spine. So basically I've lightened the spine up with these. So 200 grain, 400 spined arrows. Now I've got spin wings on them as well. These are the cheap spin wings. So someone said, well, that has a huge effect on the spine as well. All we want to do is get the bare shaft to shoot in the middle. So 400 spine, 200 grain point, 53 pounds. Now, when you shoot the 200 grain point, it's longer than the tungsten point. So I'm obviously it's harder for me to get it through the clicker. And it'll be slightly more poundage as well. So this is the bear shaft. It was always an issue for me getting arrows to tune with a recurve, because often I would jump up 2 pounds in limbs. Sometimes I didn't have to change the spine of the arrows, and sometimes I did. And it was a bit of trial and error to get it correct. So before with my bows, I never wound them up and wound them down. I just grabbed the next heaviest set of limbs. I then sell off my cheaper limbs and jump up in the next poundage to limbs, if that makes sense. Because I figured, well, I'm moving up in poundage, I'll just grab the next limbs, that way I don't have to change anything on the bow. And alright, let's take a look at that. So this is, you can see the unfletched arrows still in line. So it looks pretty good. So what we're going to do now is move back further. The further back you move for tuning, the more, especially with bear shaft, the more magnified the arrows will be. The 200 grain points, I'm interested to see if the arrows are more forgiving than 120 grain points. There is a theory that if you've got a heavy front of center, especially with recurve, and in wind, that the arrows will be more forgiving in the wind and to shoot with fingers. So I'm interested to see if that's the case. So we've moved back another, we're probably around 14 meters. So I've gone back another bit, and then we'll go back to 18. But at this distance, it's still giving me a rough indication of how I'm going. Again, the arrow's clicking too early. And these are the tungsten 120 grain points. Now with the tungsten, you've got to understand the point is significantly shorter than the 200 grain, which is a longer point inside. So it should be giving you a bit more flex to the arrow, and when the 200 will be stiffening up the spine. So although you think the 200 spine point at the front is going to make the shaft softer, it's actually much, much longer. So that's going to actually stiffen up the arrow. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. So you think it's going to soften it, but it's actually stiffening it as well. So today, one of my suppliers who makes points said, I'm going to charge you $1.40 a dozen extra because the points are going to be hardened, and the other supplier doesn't harden their points, so they're more likely to bend. And he's like, are you okay with that? I'm like, sure. I'm hoping it's $1.40 a dozen and not $1.40 extra each point. Alright, let's go and take a look. Okay, so here the arrow is slightly high, so that's an indicator of knocking point. Now this string's the same string off my old bow, and the arrow rest is in the middle, so I would expect it would be okay. Slightly to the left, so it indicates slightly stiff still, so you could go up in poundage, but let's try the 200 grains and see how they look. So hopefully they'll be okay, because what I'd like to do is shoot some target scores with 200 grain points, see what sort of scores I shoot, and then be able to try them for clout archery where I have to shoot 165 meters. Now I'll say before, when I shot clout, I shot heavier points, but I didn't put the time in to the recurve clout that I did in the compound when I shot compound with clout. So I really want to get these arrows for clout. When I say these arrows, I don't know if I'm going to be shooting these, but I want my clout arrows to be perfectly tuned so I can shoot target with them, but I want them at the right speed so they drop into the target at the right distance, if that makes sense. One thing you'll notice about shooting a heavier arrow with a heavier point is it quietens the bow down quite a lot. I had a customer come in today. He said, you did a video on quietening your bow, and I said, what makes a really big difference is shooting a heavier arrow. So this is the unfletched arrow, and then we'll shoot the fletched arrow last. It's always better to shoot groups because it could just be a bad shot. So it would be better to have multiple unfletched arrows. But for this experiment, like I'm happy to have two fletched because I can see what the group's like, and have the one unfletched to see kind of where it sits. So for me, with these points, the draw length's the clicker needs to be moved forward. But it still gives me a good indication of how this bow poundage and how these arrows will perform. Now I made these arrows with spin wings, so these are the Rick McKinney 400s, which are a very lightweight carbon arrow with a very heavy point. So I've done a lot of front, forward of center because I really want to see how they shoot in the wind. And I also want to see how I shoot with spin wings. Shaking all over the place. So with recurve, basically, once your body is adjusted to the poundage you're shooting, you want to go up in poundage because it's going to come off your fingers cleaner, build muscles, build strength. You should shoot better with a higher poundage as long as you can handle it. So you don't want to go to a poundage that's too heavy. So this is me moving 51 to 53 pounds. And you can see with the 53, the draw length was obviously a little bit too long because I started to get the shakes with 53. But I'm still trying to push my body to get used of the higher poundage. And if I do have to drop back to 51 for competition, say, my body is stronger from shooting 53 pounds. Okay, so we're here. Look, the unfletched arrow is high. This is again indicated by knocking point. Fractionally off cross, but it's not bad. Last time I did this with 53, this was off to here and these were in there. And at 150 grains, the bare shaft was off the target, off here, my shoulder width apart. So there's 53 pounds, 2 pounds has made a huge, huge difference. Now what I would do, and what I intend to do from this video, is I'm relatively happy with this. So I'm relatively happy, and my next priority is shooting clout archery. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to concentrate on those 400 spined arrows, the McKinneys with 200 grain points, and we're going to shoot some scores indoor with them. And sort of see how I shoot, see what sort of scores I shoot, and that will then tell me how I'm going. Maybe I've got to wind up the bow poundage a little bit because the arrow is slightly across to the left, but it's still okay as far as I'm concerned. We could go back further and make sure it is. We could adjust the plunger button. To me, this is all close enough to adjust the plunger button to get the tune correct. So that's the tension or left and right on the plunger button to get the tune correct. The 2 pounds has made all the difference in getting the spine to work of the arrows. So I think the 500s was a touch on the weak side and 400s were too heavy for the 51 pounds. But at 53 and a little bit, the arrows become very suitable, and in fact the point weight doesn't look like at this stage to make that much difference. However, in the past I have used point weight to get the tune correct, but at this stage I'm going to use the 200 grain points on the McKinneys and see how I shoot with them. So with archery, it's a gradual process. So now I'm going to shoot some scores, and then I'm going to do a little bit of fine tuning with the plunger, maybe like clicking the tension up or down, and see what sort of scores I can shoot, because I've never shot as good with spin wings up close as I have plastic vanes. So this is really going to be a trial for me to see how I shoot. So that's my next step. So that's 200 and 120 grain points with 400 spine arrows, 53 pounds, 29 inches. Now bear in mind that limbs are not limbs. So one of my staff here went for 40-pound limbs on one brand and 40 pounds on another. Completely different spined arrows he required, because one 40-pound set of limbs was significantly faster. The MX-10 limbs from Win and Win are 20 feet per second faster than the equivalent of another brand. So 20 feet per second, significant poundage adjustments. So that may make you change your spine. So you always have to set up your limbs with your arrows to get it all to match.